When a routine traffic stop becomes a career-defining moment, a police officer's worst assumptions collide with a truth he never anticipated. His target is the man who holds his future in his hands. The sun was dipping low over the streets of Sacramento, casting golden and amber streaks across the sky. James Carter was driving home after a grueling day at the office. His sedan purred quietly as he adjusted the air conditioning, eager to unwind. The radio hummed softly, a gentle counterpoint to the city's bustle. Approaching a yellow light, he slowed just as it turned red. Then, blue and red lights flashed in his rearview mirror, accompanied by the sharp wail of a police siren. James glanced back, his brow creasing slightly. He pulled over, lowering his window as a police cruiser parked behind him. Out stepped Officer Nathan Brooks, mid-30s, with a buzz cut and a badge glinting on his chest. Brooks adjusted his belt, striding toward James's car with the confidence of someone accustomed to control. "License and registration," Brooks said brusquely, his tone flat but edged with authority. James complied silently, retrieving his registration from the glove compartment and handing over his driver's license. His movements were calm, deliberate, but he felt Brooks's eyes dissecting him, as if probing for an excuse to escalate. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Brooks asked, leaning closer to the window. "I'm not entirely sure," James replied evenly, his voice polite but steady. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," Brooks said, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. James frowned but nodded. "I see. I thought I slowed in time, but I understand." Brooks didn't respond immediately. Instead, he lingered, his eyes narrowing as he studied James more closely. This was no longer a routine stop, at least not for Brooks. His posture shifted subtly, as if he'd already decided this was more than a minor infraction. Glancing at the license, Brooks asked, "You're not from around here, are you?" James paused briefly before answering. "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Brooks wasn't really listening. His questions grew sharper, hinting that he was no longer focused on a traffic violation. James's calm demeanor seemed to unsettle him. Leaning closer, Brooks asked, "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" "Just going home," James replied, his tone unwavering despite the palpable shift in the air. Brooks no longer saw James as just a driver saw something suspicious. James sensed the tension rising, but remained composed. Little did Brooks know, James's calm wasn't naivety, it was control. This was just the beginning. Brooks stepped back, folding James's documents with exaggerated slowness before tucking them into his chest pocket. He straightened, his expression faintly smug, as though he'd already judged the man before him. "Step out of the car for me," Brooks ordered. James's grip on the steering wheel tightened briefly, but his face showed no reaction. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked, his tone measured. Brooks's lips twitched, but he masked it quickly. "I asked you to step out. You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be." The unspoken threat hung heavy. James exhaled slowly, opened the door, and stepped out. Brooks's eyes scanned him, sizing him up. James stood slightly taller than the officer, his broad shoulders unthreatening in a tailored suit, his polished shoes hinting at meticulous care. Yet none of that seemed to matter to Brooks. Brooks gestured toward the front of the car. "Hands where I can see them." James complied, his movements deliberate. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" Brooks smirked faintly. "Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. Can't be too careful." James turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Brooks. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or does this have more to do with something else?" The question hit hard, and for a moment, Brooks's composure wavered. He straightened, his hand drifting toward his belt more out of reflex than necessity. "Watch your tone," he said, his voice hardening. "I'm simply asking a question," James replied, his quiet firmness unsettling Brooks further. Brooks leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "You seem awfully familiar with how this works. Got something to hide?" James let the silence linger before answering. "No, officer. I just believe in being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this. Transparency, you know." Brooks scoffed, but didn't reply. He stepped back, pacing a small circle in front of the car. The dynamic was shifting in ways he couldn't grasp. James wasn't reacting like most Pioplino fear. No stammering, just control and an unsettling calm that put Brooks on edge. You seem pretty confident, Brooks muttered, almost to himself, like you think you know what's going to happen next. James didn't take the bait. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is. Brooks froze for a moment before turning to face him. The smugness was gone, replaced by something defensive. He opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. James's composure was throwing him off, and he didn't like it. As the silence stretched, the tension felt electric. Brooks was starting to realize this wouldn't play out as he'd expected, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. The real test was about to begin. Brooks tapped his fingers against his holster, his frustration barely concealed. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like James. His gaze flicked to the sedan, as if searching for a justification he hadn't yet found. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Brooks said, his voice clipped. "I need to check for weapons." James raised an eyebrow. "Weapons?" he repeated, his tone incredulous but controlled. "Do I look like someone carrying a weapon?" Brooks's jaw tightened, his composure cracking. "I'm not going to ask again." James hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Then, without a word, he turned and placed his palms on the hood. Brooks approached, his boots crunching on the asphalt, breaking the uneasy silence. He patted James down in quick, rough movements, his hands lingering longer than necessary in an attempt to assert dominance, to provoke. But James didn't flinch, didn't stiffen, didn't shift under the scrutiny. "You're clean," Brooks muttered, stepping back. The admission sounded begrudging, as if he was irritated at finding nothing to justify his suspicion. James turned to face him, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp. "Of course I am," he said simply. "Now, officer, if you're done." "I'm not done," Brooks interrupted, his voice rising slightly, betraying his need to stay in control. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why?" James folded his arms, his posture relaxed despite the crackling tension. "I've had my share of interactions with law enforcement," he said. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Brooks's eyes narrowed. "So, you a lawyer or something?" James smiled faintly. "Or something." The ambiguity irritated Brooks further. He stepped closer, invading James's space, his voice dropping to a near growl. "Listen, you think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" James met his gaze evenly, unflinching. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And so far, I'm not seeing much of it here." The words hung like a challenge, and Brooks took the bait. "Fairness? You think fairness is what this is about?" "People like you always," he stopped abruptly, the words lingering like smoke, though they hadn't fully escaped. James's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted subtly, signaling he'd caught what Brooks left unsaid. "People like me," James repeated, his voice soft but charged. Brooks bristled, stepping back as if realizing he'd crossed a line. "You know what I mean," he muttered, his tone lacking conviction. "I think I do," James replied quietly. His calmness was no longer pacified, was razor-sharp, cutting through the pretense. "And I think we both know this stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago." Brooks opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time, he looked uncertain, unsure how to proceed. The balance of power was shifting, and he was on shaky ground. But the moment of reckoning was still to come, and it would be unforgettable. James's voice broke the heavy silence, steady and unyielding. "Officer, I think it's time you know who I am." Brooks's brows knitted, his irritation resurfacing. "I don't care who you are," he shot back, though a faint crack in his tone suggested otherwise. James reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said calmly, watching Brooks's hand twitch near his holster. "No need for theatrics. I want you to see it." The words hung heavy with something unspoken. Brooks's eyes followed as James pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge. "James Carter," James said, his tone as casual as if he were greeting a colleague. "Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." Brooks froze, his eyes darting to the badge, then back to James's face, searching for a sign this was a joke. But there was no humor in James's expression, only quiet authority and a hint of disappointment. "Internal Affairs," Brooks repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes," James interrupted, sparing him the effort. I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that those wearing this badge uphold the integrity and values it represents. Brooks's face paled, his confident demeanor unraveling. He took a small step back, his hand falling away from his belt, as if the weight of his authority had become too heavy. James stepped forward, closing the gap Brooks had created. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Brooks?" he asked, his voice calm but piercing. Brooks didn't answer, looking like a man who'd just stepped into quicksand with no escape. "It's not the profiling," James continued, "though that's bad enough. It's not the baseless escalation either. It's that you've done all this without realizing who you were talking to. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold. And why?" Brooks opened his mouth, but no words came. James's gaze bore into him, unrelenting. "Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect," James finished. His words weren't angry, but they carried the weight of an indictment. "And that's not just a problem for me, officer. That's a problem for everyone you encounter in that uniform." Brooks's shoulders sagged, the weight of James's words hitting hard. He glanced at the badge again, as if hoping it might vanish. James stepped back, giving Brooks a moment to breathe, but his voice retained its edge. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to return my documents and think very carefully about what you say next." Brooks hesitated, clearly torn between pushing back and complying. The hesitation cost him, James added, his voice lowering. "You're going to hear from me again not as a driver you stopped, but as the man deciding whether you're fit to wear that badge." Brooks swallowed hard, his face reddening as the moment sank in. He reached into his pocket, pulled out James's license and registration, and handed them over, his hands trembling slightly. James took them without a word, tucking them into his wallet. He stepped toward his car, pausing with one hand on the door handle. He looked back at Brooks one last time. "Remember this, Officer Brooks," James said. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." As James slid into his car and started the engine, Brooks stood in the fading light, his confidence shattered and his future uncertain. For James, this was far from over. His next move would ripple through the department. The drive home was quiet, but James's mind was racing. The encounter wasn't unique, was all too familiar. Brooks wasn't the first officer he'd faced like this, and he wouldn't be the last. But this time, James had the authority to act. The next morning, James sat at his desk in the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, early sunlight streaming through the blinds. A file lay open before him. Officer Nathan Brooks. His record wasn't clean. Minor complaints of unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, and vague issues that had never been properly addressed. James leaned back, fingers steepled, considering the broader implications. Brooks wasn't an outlier. He was a symptom of a deeper problem. James wasn't interested in quick fixes. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Sarah, stepped in with a stack of reports. "Morning, Mr. Carter. Here's the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Thompson wanted to remind you about the department review next week." James nodded, taking the files. "Thanks, Sarah. Can you schedule a meeting with Chief Thompson for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss." Sarah hesitated, sensing the weight in his tone. "Of course," she said, slipping out. James returned to Brooks's file, but his focus was broader in the culture that allowed someone like Brooks to feel justified. And culture, he knew, started at the top. That afternoon, James sat across from Chief Thompson in a conference room. Thompson, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned back, listening as James recounted the traffic stop. "I could have written it off as another bad interaction," James said, his voice resolute. "But that would have been a mistake. Brooks's behavior isn't isolated. It reflects how much work we still have to do." Thompson rubbed his temples, exhaling. "This isn't the first time Brooks's name has come up," he admitted. "But we've always handled it internally, quietly." "That's the problem," James replied. "Quiet doesn't fix anything. It lets it keep happening. It's time to be loud." Thompson leaned forward, hands clasped. "What are you proposing?" "A department-wide review," James said without hesitation. "Not just of officers, but of our training, protocols, and accountability systems. We can't keep ignoring this. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can the community trust us?" Thompson's face showed the weight of the moment. You're going to ruffle feathers. Good, James said. It's about time. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and reports. James worked tirelessly, compiling data, speaking with officers, and holding public forums to hear from the community. The Brooks incident became a catalyst, forcing the department to confront its flaws head-on. Brooks faced an internal hearing. James made no secret of his involvement, sitting across from Brooks and watching him squirm. The hearing resulted in a suspension, but James knew the real victory was in preventing the next Brooks. Months later, James stood at a community event, addressing officers, city officials, and residents. He spoke not of blame, but of responsibility, of the shared duty to build a better system. Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys, James said, his voice resonating. It's about ensuring those sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for everyone. That's the badge I believe in, and that's the badge we're building together. The applause was thunderous, but James didn't linger. For him, this wasn't the end, it was the beginning. As he stepped down, he glanced at the crowd, some skeptical, some hopeful, but all listening. Change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come. For now, that was enough. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's start the conversations that matter, the ones that lead to change. Subscribe for more stories like this, stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us what's possible when we stand for what's right.